The education minister says that as part of the new proposed education bill,
Trustees will continue to play a role, but that role will change significantly.
so what role have trustees played up till now? Here's TVO Today's John Michael McGrath to break down the background and what's set to change. John Michael, great to have you as always.
Thank
How are you
so
doing?
Much. Good.
All right, before we begin, for our viewers and listeners, in the interest of full disclosure, TVO falls under the purview of the Ministry of Education. Of course, we have to mention that. All right, what are the main changes introduced in Bill 101?
Right, so this is the Putting Student Achievement First Act, and broadly speaking, it does two big things. One, it imposes a lot more financial restraint and oversight on school boards, particularly the public and Catholic English-speaking boards. And then it also does make some structural changes to the school boards themselves, particularly in Toronto.
All right, when we're talking about the number of trustees as well,
Yes.
We go from, won't see massive changes across the province, but Toronto will see a big change there.
Yeah, this was one area where the government really did single out the Toronto Public School Board, the TDSB. It will be shrunk from 22 to 12 trustees. That will match the number of trustees in the Toronto Catholic School Board. Critics of the government would say that the TDSB still handles a higher number of students, still has more properties to manage than the Catholic board does, so it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. But from the government's perspective, they see, these are two boards serving the same city, they should be the same size.
All right, and bargaining changes a little bit as well.
Yeah, this is a big one. I think in some ways it might actually be the most notable change in Bill 101. For people who have a longer memory of how education policy goes in Ontario, it really maybe the final nail in the coffin of the idea of school boards as really the primary employer in education. School boards will no longer be involved in the collective bargaining process directly when it comes to negotiating with education unions. This is a long process that started in some cases decades ago, of the province really taking more of an active role in labor negotiations. The process now will actually be, instead of school board trustees being part of the negotiations, the position of school board chief executive officers. They will, the province is both creating that position with Bill 101, and those CEOs will now be the ones negotiating with education unions. The role of the trustees will simply be ratifying the agreement when it is hammered out.
So for our viewers and listeners, how many school boards do we actually have here in the province?
We do have 72 school boards in Ontario. Now that's a mix of the both English-speaking public and Catholic boards, as well as the smaller but still substantial French public and Catholic boards as well. A whole bunch of historical changes. Those Catholic boards were only ever established in 1998, I recently learned. But the history of school boards goes back to, frankly, they're older than the province of Ontario itself.
All right, when it comes to school trustees, how are they selected?
They are elected. I mentioned they're old bodies. They are, in fact, the oldest elected bodies in Ontario. We were electing school board trustees before we were electing MPPs or MPs or city councillors or anything like that. But there are some cases where those school boards lose those powers. Of course, the Minister of Education can appoint an overseer for a school board who then is just an appointed person with all of the powers of the board, but is not an elected person.
All right, help us understand what are sort of the main functions of a school board trustee, and on the flip side, what can't they actually do?
These days, the main function of the school boards is to administer the financial side of it. Until Bill 101 is actually passed and in effect, it is still the job of the school board trustees to, for example, put together the budget and pass the budget. Under Ontario law, they are supposed to be balancing their budgets. One of the complaints from this government is that some school boards have not been doing that. They are also overseers in a sense of, in the sense of a board of directors. They are supposed to make sure that it was particularly within their sort of local wards, within these school boards, they are there as, I guess, kind of elected ombudsmen, so that when somebody within their ward, for example, wants to complain about the way the school is being run, they can voice that complaint to their elected representative, who can then be the interface between the public and the actual operations of the school.
All right. In terms of what they can't do.
Right, they're not supposed to be operating in a way that is like directly interfering in the day-to-day operations of a school. That is, the school board has a whole other sort of bureaucracy and a chain of command, if you like, from the director of education to the superintendents to the school principals, who are all supposed to be relatively insulated from the elected officials. Of course, and there's also a long history of this. It's not exactly a separation of church and state. School board trustees do sometimes, wade further into the operational details than the law strictly imagines them doing, and everybody knows that that goes on.
As you mentioned, they are elected, so do school board trustees have term limits?
No, there are no term limits, but they do tend to serve for longer extended periods. That's true of a lot of local elections, right? Municipal mayors and city councilors frequently serve very long careers, but no strict term limit, no.
All right, and when it comes to salaries, I know Bill 101 addresses sort of the honorariums there. What's the change there?
Right, so decades ago, the provincial government of the day eliminated salaries as a position, really emphasizing that they wanted school board trustees to be really a part-time position, not quite a volunteer position, but they didn't want this to become a career avenue for elected politicians. In the ensuing decades, school boards were allowed to issue honoraria. Those honoraria have grown, particularly in the GTA. They are now something between $25,000 and $35,000, depending on which school board you look at in the GTA. Bill 101 would cap that number at about $10,000 per year.
All right. This was fantastic background information. John Michael, sit back because you're going to join us in our next conversation.
Absolutely.